In a land where freedom was won with fists, fire, and sacrifice, a man stood up and compared a whisper to a war cry. President Cyril Ramaphosa dared to place his ANC monologue alongside the sacred Freedom Charter and the legendary Cordessa talks. But for millions of South Africans, this wasn't bold. It was blasphemy. Cordessa was born from real danger when bullets and batons couldn't silence the people's dream. The Freedom Charter was not signed in comfort. It was carved from courage. Now, one man takes 40% of the vote and claims 72% of the power. He calls it dialogue. But whose voice is being heard? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré doesn't hide behind stages. He walks among his people, speaks in the open, and lets his actions speak louder than any applause. So I ask you, what happens when democracy is performed, not practiced? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that no longer bows its head. The fall of a giant. There was a time when the African National Congress could fill stadiums with nothing but its name. A time when its flag meant freedom, when its leaders were symbols, not slogans, when the world looked to South Africa not with pity, but with awe. Do you remember? It was 2009. Jacob Zuma grinned from the balcony of the ANC headquarters, declaring, "No one can defeat us if we are with the people." And the people agreed. 70% of them did. The ANC stood like a colossus, untouchable, unshakable, permanent. But giants do not fall all at once. They shrink silently, year by year, and South Africa watched it happen. From 70% to 63%. Then 61. The numbers slid quietly at first. The faithful still believed. The slogans still worked. Until they didn't. By 2024, the illusion shattered. The ANC, once the custodian of the anti-apartheid dream, fell to 40%. Not in war, not by violence, but by democracy. The ballot spoke, and what did it say? That the people wanted something new, that the machine of liberation had become a machine of inertia, that slogans cannot feed a hungry child, that memories of past glory are no substitute for justice today. But here lies the heartbreak. The ANC did not listen. Instead of bowing to the democratic verdict, Ramaphosa tried to rewrite it. He dressed failure in the robes of dialogue. He summoned civic groups, unions, party members not to share power, but to retain it. He called it the ANC Monologue, compared it to Cordessa, even dared to echo the Freedom Charter. But how can a monologue be a charter? Cordessa was forged in danger when apartheid generals and freedom fighters sat across the same table, not knowing if they'd live to sign. The Freedom Charter was written by people who risked prison to dream aloud. And now, 40% is recast as 72. That's not legacy. That's theft. And the theft was not of money this time, but of meaning, of the vote, of the people's voice. Parliament said, "You have no majority." Ramaphosa said, "I'll invent one." But democracy doesn't work that way, not if it's real. And the people felt it not just in numbers, but in their bones. The man who once stood as Mandela's heir now stood as a master of illusion. And the crowd, once roaring, now murmured, "Did we win or were we tricked?" The fall of the ANC wasn't a collapse. It was a slow forgetting, a decay from inside. From freedom fighters to power holders, from servants of the people to stage performers. And that is how democracies die, not with tanks, but with silence, with applause that no longer echoes, with slogans that no longer move hearts. And yet, across the continent, a new voice was rising. In a nation poorer, smaller, with fewer headlines, Burkina Faso, and its leader was not staging dialogues. He was staging revolutions. But more on that soon. The monologue masquerade. It was supposed to be a dialogue, a moment of reflection, a gathering of voices, a fresh start. That's how Ramaphosa described it. But when the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled, South Africans saw something different. A stage, a script, a single voice echoing in a room built to contain many. He called it the ANC Monologue. He said it was national healing, but the nation didn't feel healed. Because healing doesn't happen when power speaks to itself. It happens when the wounded speak back and are heard. This gathering, this carefully curated event was not Cordessa. Cordessa was pain and risk, not press releases. The Freedom Charter was born of blood and prison cells, not soft chairs and catered meals. And yet, Ramaphosa dared to place his theater next to those sacred names. Even as major parties walked away, the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters, Action SA, MK, the Freedom Front Ramaphosa stayed on stage. Even as civic groups withdrew foundations that once supported the ANC, he kept performing. Because it wasn't about consensus, it was about control. The setting was polished. The microphones passed from hand to hand. But the real halls of power, Parliament, Cabinet, the Constitutional Court, were empty, absent, because this was not governance. It was a rebranding exercise, a last attempt to reframe 40% as a mandate. And when citizens stood up, raised their voices, what did they say? Stop talking down to us. You don't decide for us. Nothing for us without us. They shouted, not because they were angry at being invited, but because they realized too late what they had been invited to. Not dialogue, not democracy, but theater. A one-man play with bad lighting and borrowed lines. And the more the president spoke, the more the people recoiled. One woman, tears in her eyes, said, "This feels like a funeral for our vote." And maybe she was right. Because behind the applause, behind the polite clapping of ANC loyalists, lay something much deeper. The quiet death of democratic practice. No tanks, no bans, no coups, just an event. That looked like progress. That smelled like unity, but tasted like betrayal. Observers saw it too. One journalist called it a rebellion against the voter. Another, more blunt, a coup in slow motion. Because when a man loses the vote but keeps the power and then builds a room to pretend he earned it, what do you call that? You don't call it dialogue. You call it performance. And the audience, they've stopped clapping. They've started watching and waiting. Because somewhere in that same continent, someone else, someone younger, is not rehearsing. He's acting. His name is Captain Ibrahim, but we'll return to him soon. Traoré in the African mirror, across the continent, far from the soundproof walls of South Africa's political theater. A different kind of stage was being built, not with microphones, but with bricks, not with speeches, but with action. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré faced a nation at breaking point insurgency in the north, poverty in the cities, and distrust in the streets. And what did he do? He didn't rent a hall and call it healing. He walked into the chaos, not as an actor, as a soldier, as a man willing to face his people, not with apologies, but with answers. Captain Ibrahim's latest news isn't a press release. It's a construction site. It's a nationalized gold mine. It's a military reform. It's a truth spoken without disguise. In 2023, while Ramaphosa orchestrated applause, Traoré shut down foreign mining contracts that exploited his country's wealth. He didn't form a committee. He signed the order. He didn't wait for permission. He declared a new direction. Housing projects rose. Military corruption fell. Schools reopened. And people, even critics, began to say one thing. At least he's real. You may not agree with every move Traoré makes. You may question his methods, challenge his ideology. But you cannot deny this. His leadership has weight. Not the weight of title, but of trust. Not the weight of performance, but of presence. While Ramaphosa reimagined himself as the center of a new parliament, Traoré reminded his people that power should walk with the barefoot, not speak above them. Burkina Faso. Latest news has little to do with talking points and everything to do with turning points. And here lies the mirror. Two leaders, two countries, two choices. One built a room to sound louder. The other built roads to move faster. One inflated numbers. The other deflated excuses. One called 40% a victory. The other called injustice by name. And African citizens are watching, not just in Ouagadougou or Johannesburg, but in Accra, in Nairobi, in Lagos, in the Bronx, in Atlanta. Black people everywhere are watching, because this is no longer just about two leaders. It's about which Africa will rise. The one that performs liberation, or the one that practices it and to you.
Watching. Now, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below.
Let them know that dignity cannot be staged. Let them know that sovereignty is not a costume. Let them know that Captain Ibrahim's latest news is not in what he says, but what he does. And if that makes you hopeful, stay with us, because the story isn't over. Democracy Rewritten. Democracy is not just about elections. It's about what happens after the vote is cast. In South Africa, the people voted. The message was clear. 40%. Not a landslide, not a mandate, a reality check. But instead of accepting it, President Ramaphosa chose a different path. He didn't go to Parliament where the law demands accountability. He didn't consult the Constitution where the rules are written. He went to a stage, a hall, a controlled space, and there he created a new number, 72%. That's how many seats in his cabinet went to ANC loyalists. How? Through a deal. Through maneuvers, through quiet negotiations that defied the very spirit of the vote. He didn't share power, he absorbed it. He didn't build a coalition, he built an illusion. And that illusion is dangerous, because once the rules bend, they rarely straighten. And once power is seized in the name of unity, it rarely returns to the people. What Ramaphosa did was not illegal, but it was immoral. He rewrote the will of the people with appointments, not amendments, with photo ops, not policies, and citizens felt it immediately. A young voter in Soweto said, "We voted for change. They gave us more of the same." A mother in Durban asked, "If 40% gives you the presidency, why should I vote again?" And that question, whispered in homes and shouted in protests, is the real crisis, because democracy is a fragile covenant. It lives only if people believe their voice matters. But what happens when they stop believing? When the vote becomes a ritual, not a right. When elections are followed by erasure, what happens is erosion not of buildings, but of trust. And without trust, there is no democracy, just performance, just pretense. And South Africa has seen this before. Under Zuma, Parliament was reduced to a rubber stamp. During the Nkandla scandal, the institutions failed. And now, under Ramaphosa, history echoes, but this time, the people are more aware. They've seen leaders in Burkina Faso make bold decisions. They've seen Captain Ibrahim act, not pretend. They know what courage looks like now. They know what real accountability sounds like. So when Ramaphosa stands alone in a hall and calls it healing, they know better. They see the game. And many refuse to play. Civil society groups are filing petitions. Young voters are organizing online. Activists are documenting every inconsistency because they know this isn't just about 2024. It's about the soul of the republic. It's about whether South Africa will continue sliding into a post-democratic shell where elections exist, but don't matter, or whether it will rise, reclaim its institutions, and say, enough. Power must come from the people, not from a script, not from applause, not from a monologue. And if Ramaphosa wants to be remembered, not as the man who betrayed democracy, but as the one who defended it, then he must step back, not from leadership, but from illusion, because the world is watching. And so is Africa. The world is watching. Across oceans and continents, in embassies and boardrooms, the whispers have grown louder. What's happening in South Africa? The country once hailed as the moral compass of the post-colonial world, the land of Mandela. The architect of reconciliation is now at the center of an uncomfortable question. Is South Africa still a democracy in practice, or just in name? From Washington to Brussels, the headlines are shifting. Where once they read Beacon of Hope, now they say Democratic backslide. Western analysts, familiar with their own democratic crises, recognize the signs. A leader inflating power after a weak election, institutions sidelined, citizens silenced beneath the weight of performance politics. They've seen this before in countries they once condemned. Now, it's South Africa's turn under the lens. In the United States, where democracy has battled its own tests, commentators ask, What happens when a vote no longer decides the outcome? Older Americans, those who watched Watergate unfold or marched with Martin Luther King, see something eerily familiar. The silence before the storm, because they know when power is unchecked, it spreads like shadow. And South Africa's ANC Monologue has become a warning, not just to Africa, but to every democracy at risk of forgetting its soul. But this isn't just a cautionary tale. It's also a contrast, because while South Africa rebrands illusion as inclusion, nations like Burkina Faso are rewriting the rules with action. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, decisions are not staged. They're executed. Gold mines have been reclaimed, corrupt contracts torn up, resources redirected to citizens, not shareholders. International observers are taking note. Captain Ibrahim's latest news is not about speeches. It's about sovereignty. And that makes governments nervous and citizens inspired. Young Africans, from Dakar to D.C., are asking if they can do it there. Why not here? The strategic implications are real. The U.S. has long considered South Africa a democratic anchor, a partner in development and diplomacy. But if South Africa falters, if institutions become props and power becomes theater, that role crumbles and new centers of influence emerge. Burkina Faso. Latest news is being watched not for its instability, but for its courage. And for some, that courage is more attractive than stability wrapped in lies. So now, a choice stands before not just leaders, but citizens. Will South Africa be the example of resilience or the warning of regression? Will African democracy be defined by monologues or by movements? The world is watching, but more importantly, Africa is listening. Democracy does not die with gunshots. It dies with silence, with overlooked speeches, with polite clapping that masks quiet collapse. And this is where South Africa stands today. The ANC Monologue may have seemed like just another event, another televised moment in a long political season. But beneath its surface, it carried something far more dangerous. The attempt to replace the ballot box with the stage. When 40% is rebranded as 72, that is not governance. That is rebellion, not against the opposition, not against parliament, but against the very people who voted. And here lies the deepest tragedy. The same party that once held the world's respect, that once carried the hopes of a liberated continent, now stands accused of betraying its own legacy. But across the continent, a different vision is taking shape. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim's latest news is not theater. It is reality, concrete, visible, measurable. He is not performing justice. He is enacting it. This isn't to romanticize one leader or vilify another. It is to remind all of us, especially the elders who marched for freedom and the youth who voted for the first time in 2024, we have a choice: to accept the slow erosion of our voice or to rise and speak louder, because silence now is complicity. And democracy cannot defend itself. That's our job as citizens, as Africans, as people who believe that our votes matter. So let this be your moment. Leave a comment. Do you believe Ramaphosa is protecting democracy or quietly rewriting it? Should South Africa follow the model of scripted unity or the bold sovereignty seen in Burkina Faso? Say it loud and say it proud. Africa knew. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.